Okay, to resume our discussion.
Did you get what Caroline had said?
No.
None of it?
Well, I don't know how much.
So start over. What were, you asked her
Okay,
what her initial impression was and what she thought of it.
So, I have always experienced Stein's poetry and a lot of Stein's writing as as not needing to have a fixed meaning, or maybe having multiple meaning possibilities. And that's one of the things I've enjoyed about Stein over the years. Is like different critics interpret her differently, and I, at different moments of my life or different moments of my day, interpret her differently. And I feel like that is sort of part of her project. The idea of repetition, which is also some of the things that you gave us to read. That
Hold the fork.
her use of repetition and the idea that a rose is a rose is a rose, and each rose is different. That you're at a different moment when you read that second rose, and so it has a different meaning for you. I do feel like this line about an arrangement and a system to pointing is really fascinating and a little vexing, because I'm having I have this kind of feeling that there's a meaning for it that I'm yearning for. So I experience a little moment of yearning there, but I'm not arriving at a meaning right now, or I'm arriving at lots of fragments of meaning in my mind.
What are some fragments that are bouncing around?
Well, system, she could be using system in a really kind of loving way. Like she could be using it to refer to something that is hers to play with, like grammar. Or it could be that she's using it in a somewhat oppressive way. And an arrangement in a system, and the system's pointing, so is it a sort of a punitive system or an overly sort of controlling system? And then if, like Bob was saying, if, there's this, I also read the Carafe in the mirror, I sort of assumed that the spectacle was referring to reflection, and the cousin was maybe referring to reflection and something lesser than or different than the real, quote unquote. And what does that have to do with the system? I have questions there, and I'm really enjoying those questions. And I think that's, for me, always been a lot of the pleasure of reading Stein, is that there's multiple possibilities for understanding or hypothesizing.
And then, Bob, you had a number of points to follow Caroline.
Take the fork.
Yeah, we were talking about it during the hiatus in recording. And to me, I read spectacle as glasses, the pedestrian interpretation. And I felt that, again, a system to pointing was talking about language and the difficulty in it. I agree with you in terms of the ambiguity. And I think that ambiguity and obfuscation is built into this. I think that's part of what she's saying, is the difficulty of using language to communicate. And I think that it's no coincidence that this leads the entire Tinder buttons. It's the very first thing in the object section. Mm-hmm. So I really think that, all this not ordered, not unordered, and not resembling is talking about the system of how we communicate, how we think, and use these tokens of words, and move them around. So I think she's drawing on that. One of the things you mentioned on reading was about what she's saying about nouns. A noun is the name of anything. Why after a thing is named, write about it. A name is adequate, or is it not? That what does a name mean? These names we give things. So I think that what she's talking about is the whole process of using language, and she's saying that it's not working as well as it did.
Mm-hmm. Rodney, what do you think?
The fork is yours.
I actually didn't understand this until I read Marjorie Perloff. So there, and a single hurt color, for instance, is red wine. Wittgenstein says that Stein is not using language for information, but is making it strange, forcing us to be acutely aware of the way words work Here, for example, is the first of the objects in Tinder buttons, a carafe that is a blind, which is an important point about Stein, I think. But this poem seems easier than the ones that follow it.
Here, can you film me? Horizontally. Well, something I wonder about how we can consider the carafe itself, though of course we can't access the carafe without the word carafe. There's no picture of a carafe or a literal carafe. We're not at a tavern where we have a carafe among us. We just have, like, you can look through this at me. We just have plastic cups of coffee. But an arrangement and a system to pointing, does we understand that? How do we understand that if that refers to the object that the word carafe refers to? Or do we see this as not about the object that carafe corresponds to, but about the word carafe itself and the work that it's doing as an object being a word?
But what does a carafe do? You fill a carafe with something.
Wine.
In the same way, wine, water.
You could fill it
No,
with
you
anything.
can't fill it with water.
Sure you can.
Carafe is only for wine.
No, you could fill it with orange juice.
Well, there's
Freshly
an
squeezed
example of
orange juice.
interpretation.
Well, I think filling it with wine is an example of
Well,
interpretation.
it's two. They're both, yeah.
Yeah.
But here she says
here.
the first
Here-
color.
The thing is, if I might point out, though, the craft is empty until you put something into it, in the same way that we put meaning into words.
Well, she's saying here that it's a single hurt color, red, which is the color of wine. So that's why I took it to be a wine glass.
Okay. Why is it hurt?
That's a good question. Why is it hurt? Because it's about to be drunk, I guess.
Here, give it back.
I was just going to say that hurt. I mean, if you look at the words in here, blind, hurt, yeah, and so I mean, this is why a lot of people, when we were discussing the poem, in the forums, a lot of people interpret this positively, but I don't see. To me, that's bolting on some optimism to it, because I don't see that here. But in a way that's ambiguous, you can. So,
How do you see it positively?
Sorry, see
You,
the color.
no, the tender button. Do you
A
see it
carafe.
positive? Do you see its instability and like your own inability to kind of pin it down as a positive?
Oh, absolutely,
event? And
absolutely.
Could you talk about that?
Well, I guess it's sort of like negative capability. That there's one thing that I have found very interesting about Stein.
Which is from who coined the phrase negative capability?
Keats, right? Keats.
Yes.
And that's sort of, I mean, with Stein in particular, I think one of the pleasures of her writing, is that it's inspired this tremendous body of theorizing, that some of which is still going on. And, so you can read other people sort of grappling with what she's doing, both in micro, like in individual poems, and like just her overall project. And it's fascinating. I mean, obviously, people, it's like a Talmudic, people are sort of arguing about how to interpret certain things that she did. And also about her as a figure, obviously. Like, she's a very ambiguous figure to the extent that matters. But to me, it's just a pleasure to, depending on what I'm reading or thinking about or what I've read about her recently, I can go back and have a completely different experience with something she's written. Now, I haven't read Tender Buttons now in a long, long time. I think I read it maybe in college or right after college, most recently. Maybe I read a little bit here or there. And I'm sure I'm having a completely different, like, top to bottom experience with it. And that's pleasurable. It's different than going back to, you know, something that is guiding you much more deliberately through a narrative. And you can still go back to something like that, like, you know, Robert Frost, or, you know, something that's more maybe guiding you towards a specific understanding of the poem, and still have a different relationship to it after 25 years. But, you know, I find her to really engage my own understanding of words and grammar and, to a certain extent, politics very differently each time. Wait, why? What did you just react
I was going
to?
to say that she had a very intense relationship with painters,
Right.
and painters at the turn of the century, and after that, who were not realistic, who almost did what she's doing in paint. You know, that's fascinating. So I don't know who came first. I think the painters came first, and then she decided to put that kind of composition into her poems.
Well, and she was also very.
You have to take the mic.
And she was also very influenced by some of the linguists who were writing right after the turn of the century. And I think that, like, these sort of new excavations of language were part of her sphere of influence, too.
Well, when we went through a portrait of Picasso in the class, that's an interesting poem, you know, with the repetition and the words and whatnot. And I was reminded in the Duchamp's The Nude Dispending a Staircase, what you have there is an extended now. That view of it, you know, in Cubism, you've got all these different views of the same thing at the same time. But I think that the concept of now is extended there. And I think in some ways, one of the techniques she's using is that repetition to divorce us from, because, you know, when we read, it's one word after another, you know, and this thing, you know, we go down, you know, left to right. And how do you get out of that? How do you escape that? And I think that that's what she's doing with her repetition, is she's trying to just expand that space to give you that same effect. So,
What do we make of the phrase, of this, the penultimate sentence of this? All this and not ordinary, not unordered and not resembling.
Well, we don't make anything of it, but let's see.
Well, what does it mean? So there's ordinary and not unordered.
Ordinary would be a glass, and not unordered means it is ordered. So it's a glass that is fit for something to use.
But that there's an order beyond resemblance.
Yes. What would resemblance be?
Well, we can, I think, go back to what Bob said. What Bob said about the blind glass being a mirror, and that this is a kind of glass that doesn't reflect.
well, the blind glass being a mirror, I mean, especially how much we read into things, you know, because of what we're bringing to it, I think is very evident in these poems. But all this and not ordinary, not unordered, and not resembling can be read as I ordered and not resembling, or not unordered and resembling, because of the double. So either way, it's either ordered or unordered in helping you in resembling something or not resembling it. And again, I think this relates to words, and I felt that the not ordinary in that interpretation of it could possibly relate to you've got language and it points to something, and it points to one thing. But what is not ordinary, it does not point to, because it's outside of what you can express in that language.
Oh, that's great.
So that was the way I took that.
There's something very curious at Marjorie Perloff's article. She said Stein herself insisted that Tender Buttons was entirely realistic.
That's just reading.
In the tradition of Gustave Flaubert, I used to take objects on my table like a tumbler or any kind of object and try to get the picture of it clear and separate in my mind and create a word relationship between the word and the thing seen.
The relationship between the word and the thing seen.
Yeah.
And the fact that this is the first, the fact that this is the first one in there again, I think means everything that follows. That's what she's doing. She's defining that relationship between the word and the thing seen. The way you describe it and what is being described.
Right. Well, and also opening up the possibility of what happens if one gives an array of new language to an object that doesn't already belong to it. So a carafe is a noun that refers to a thing, but what if, I think, to be literal about it, we could think of the language, not that Stein is using metaphor, but to think metaphorically about it, we have the carafe that is filled not only with wine, but with this language inside of it, in the same way that the wine doesn't belong necessarily to the carafe, but does once you put it in the same way that once we add this flow of language and attach it just through juxtaposition to the carafe, that language is now something in the carafe.
Well, it's
and in the same way, I think, as an opening poem, in the same way, if we think about the point of a carafe is not to permanently hold wine, it's to ultimately pour it out and share and get drunk and talk with less inhibition, that in a sense we can think of this as the liquor language, as inebriating language that allows us to disinhibit our one-to-one pre-given attachments between words and things, and to allow things to swirl with new language that perhaps allows us not only to see the object differently, but to see the potential of language differently. That's my thought. Here you go.
So you're another optimist.
I want to talk. I think it's important that we talk about what you're saying and whether or not language's precision. Whether I'm filming Bob. No. You don't have to take me, but it's because I'm addressing Bob. Whether the idea of losing language's precision is necessarily, or why you would feel that would be negative. And I think it's important to remember that Stein is originally a scientist, a biologist. So she is coming from an initial relationship of language to things that is certainly that where language fastens onto things with extreme precision. Because you wouldn't want your surgeon to have a playful relationship with language. So, or would you? And what would that mean? But I'm curious about going a little further into thinking about the difference between. I don't think that it's a matter of being an optimist or Well, it is. It's a matter of how one considers the value of the relationship of language to thing. Right.
I agree with you, and my negative interpretation of this is solely based on the fact that hurt and blind. I don't see anything in here that gives a positive connotation to it. So if that's what she is talking about, why is there nothing in here that says that? Why is there painful words in here, or words where you can't see something, but nothing opposite? And that's why I take that interpretation.
Don't you take cousin positively? Or do you have bad relationship with your cousins?
Yes, I never had any good cousins.
I have a good cousin.
And cousins is also the term used to refer to the CIA, but I think that came later.
Oh, really? I mean, I personally, I can't say that I get a negative feeling from this poem. I think there are words that are deliberately a little ominous, and there are clusters of words together that are ominous, but I don't experience that as negative. I feel like I'm understanding from her, as I understand from other things I've read of her, that she's aware of threats. And I think one of the, obviously, I think one of the things that maybe is, to me, a little unclear in this poem is exactly where she's locating the threat. I mean, I do sense an ominous quality here. And to me, it is that system to pointing is part of it. And the word hurt. And I don't think I find this just playful. And I don't quite know what to make of the differences spreading. Like, that could be this really joyous sort of declaration, or it could be something that, is meant to be joyous or painful, depending on, the moment that you're reading this poem. I'm curious. I mean, I do feel like there's a threat in this.
No two instances are ever identical.
Yeah.
Even when the same phrase is used, repeated over and over again, as is common in Stein, there is always difference. That's...
Yeah, like what if the difference was spreading, was repeated 5 times?
Right.
Like the difference is spreading, the difference is spreading, the difference, you could really understand how open-ended that is, and how, I guess, generative or fecund that open-endedness can be.
I'm still obsessed with this blind glass being a mirror, and that in the title, the carafe, that is a blind glass or a mirror. And blind glass implies an inability or a kind of incapacity to see. And we think of glass as being something transparent or reflective, or as the transparent as seeing through, like a window, or transparent and seeing within, like seeing the wine within the carafe. But what would it mean for the carafe that doesn't resemble, or the word that doesn't resemble the object that it names? What would it be to look in a mirror and not to see oneself? And I think that in a way, the poem allows us to, it deflects our projections of assuming we know what we're looking at, and assuming that our language is as transparent as glass.
Well, I think she would definitely not agree with the transparency of language. I think that's something. Also, she doesn't mention here mirror or glass. She leaves them out.
This blind glass,
Oh,
according to
corrupted
Bob,
is a blind glass.
is a mirror.
I never once said rush to your dictionaries.
Right. Well, she leaves out eyeglasses, for instance.
But she has spectacles. So.
Spectacles. That's true. Well, that's a spectacle. That's a joyous, mad celebration. Not spectacles that you see with.
Don't be so literal.
Yeah, don't make a
Well,
spectacle of yourself.
spectacle is more literal than what I just said. Spectacle as eyeglasses is very literal. And I don't think she's ever literal. I still have trouble with in a system to pointing. We describe that as language language that is useful to point at an object, didn't we? Yeah. And I guess that's what she's saying there too.
But on a carafe, though, is unusual. It's not a pitcher. It doesn't have a spout.
Right.
So it doesn't exactly point to the person to the thing into which the contents will be poured. It's a kind of, it could be poured for anyone. And I always think of the difference of spreading as the wine leaching across the tablecloth, which is my own private association based on nothing. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Just one thing, which is, I think we have a question of what is the purpose of writing, or in this instance, in Stein writing, and is she trying to, the first question is she trying to communicate? And then the second is, if she's trying to communicate, what is it she's trying to communicate? And is she trying to communicate that the fact that there is ambiguity, the fact that the spectacle can mean glasses or it could mean, an event, that's what she's trying to communicate, that there is this open interpretation and that, you can get all these things out of it. But I think that in everything that we look at in terms of the poem, there's always a question of, were they intending to communicate, and if so, what?
What if she's not trying to communicate? That's the other. You didn't address the other answer.
If she's not, and I did say if, the first question is she trying to communicate? Right. And if she's not, then what is the purpose of disseminating this? What's the purpose of...
What people do that aren't communicative?
Things with their hands, and they're communicative, I guess.
Right. Is an architect communicating?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
But not in a linear informational sense.
Oh, space very much influences what happens in that space.
Right, exactly.
So when you're creating that space, you're making a statement about what interactions you expect in there. So I would say architects communicate.
Well, I would wonder if Stein is communicating more like an architect and less like a writer.
And just assembling a space for something to happen?
Mm-hmm.
What we're forgetting here is that this is erotic, and erotica, you can tell that by the title alone, and how that...
How does the title tell you?
Tender Buttons.
Oh, Tender Buttons.
Yeah. How this fits into that theme, I don't know.
It's what they're getting drunk.
Well, then they're going to be having some erotic activity after that.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the spreading. It's a sexual spreading.
How about that? Wait, we have to get that.
So
trying to solve the problem.
Well, I was responding to Rodney, who was reminding us that Tender Buttons is this erotic work, and I was saying, okay, spreading. So what if the difference that's spreading, what if that's erotic and not about either, some sort of viral spreading or dangerous? What if it's yeah, what if it is? I also feel like I wish I had more memory of some of the linguistic theory that, like Saussure and Jacobson, that was really changing the way people were experiencing language around the time Stein and before Stein was writing. I do feel like, if there's one thing that I feel is fixed about Stein's writing, it's the intelligence and the rigorousness, which seems weird when you're talking about something so playful and open-ended. But because I don't have enough framework in my conscious mind right now to go very deep with that, doesn't mean that one can't. Like, I feel like there's a lot of scaffolding here that I don't have easy access to right now, but that, when I studied Stein, some of my professors did, and you really begin to see how brilliant this is and how many different tethers, philosophical and linguistic and political tethers, she's sort of pulling together here. So I just wanted to say that.
No. We're not going to talk about that yet. All right, so let's have a final comment.
Who were Caroline's?
All right, we can leave it with Caroline's, but
my final comment is that it's an extraordinary poem, both in its pleasure and in its confusion.
And my final comment is, I am just astonished that something written over 100 years ago can be so fresh and challenging and thought-provoking. I would think that something bad would be old and tired, and nothing like that at all. I mean, that's genius.
Caroline, do you have another final?
Another final comment. So let's see.
The final comment. Your final.
No, I feel like it's interesting. There was that big exhibit of Stein's art at the Met a few years ago that ended up being really controversial because it sort of omitted certain things about her biography that people felt were important. And it was kind of fascinating to me because I felt like, okay, her personal history, her biography, her writing, her philosophy, her politics, like, it's all still being interpreted. And, like, I feel like, what was that thing that James Joyce famously said, like, I'll keep the English professors guessing for 1,000 years or something after he published Ulysses. I do feel, and she was just as, like, just as much of a braggart as he was in her own way. And I feel like she also, like, she's keeping everyone guessing for her 1,000 years or whatever.
Her politics are not to be.
Say it again.
Her politics are not to be glamorized. She didn't pay any attention to World War II, and she lived in a house in a Nazi-occupied area of France, and just treated the soldiers as not comrades, but visitors.
Okay.
What?
She translated Pétain into English.
Wait, say that again.
She translated Pétain, I can't remember his first name, but he was the head of the Vichy. Philippe Pétain,
Yeah.
into English.
Okay, and on that dark note, I'll show you the room where we are.
I mean, personally, I just would rather a person.
Like the alien community, we can talk about the